Okay, so this video is 1983, Stories from the Dukes of Hazzard, the Ghost of Hazzard County. I recently came across my old tape collection and found this gem. It's a collection of stories from the 80s TV show The Dukes of Hazzard, which of course I was a fan of. I was going to record and share the whole thing on YouTube, but unfortunately the sound quality on side A is very poor. But it is 34 years old now, and that's to be expected. Stories on side A include The Dukes of Hazzard, Here Come the Dukes of Hazzard, and Daredevil Danger. But all is not lost. The sound quality on side B is a lot better, and I can show the two stories on it. I'm glad I can, as I think they're a lot better, and these two scared the hell out of me as a kid when I used to listen to them on my own through headphones. So first up is the Ghost of Hazzard County, and on the next video I'll play The Legend of Bigfoot. That's if this one hasn't scared you to death, or YouTube hasn't blocked it, because I don't own the rights to it.
Howdy, y'all, and welcome to Hazzard County. It's not much on the map, but it's earned its place in the history books for being the home of Bo and Luke Duke. These two don't have an evil bone in their bodies, but you'd never know it if you listened to what old Boss Hogg has to say about them. You see, Boss Hogg and the Duke boys never, and I do mean never, get along. Anytime anything goes wrong anywhere in Hazzard County, Hogg is absolutely, positively, 100% certain that the Duke boys have something to do with it. Take the time poor Widow Johnson put her farmhouse up for sale. Boss Hogg had his eye on the Johnson place for years, and now that Widow Johnson was in a distressed situation, he figured this was just the chance he'd been waiting for. Now, Boss Hogg's crooked, but he's not a fool. He knew that if the judge caught wind of him buying a property, he could be in for a peck of trouble. That's how Boss Hogg's crooked cousin, Jeremiah Hogg, got into the picture. These two low-down polecats worked up a scheme to cheat the poor old widow out of her house. Jeremiah Hogg offered the widow a piddly low sum for her property. Then these two field rats set about making sure no one else put in a bid on the house. Boss Hogg figured there was only one kind of house no one in their right mind would want to buy. A haunted house. Boss Hogg's plan went something like this. While he kept Widow Johnson busy in the parlor listening to her talk, and the good widow does like to talk, Cousin Jeremiah snuck up to the attic with Boss Hogg's stereo and a spooky sound effects record that they picked up at the Five and Dime. Jeremiah rigged up speakers all over the house and then settled in. His job was to make sure any folks who came around to look at the widow's house got frightened off. Boss Hogg drove away in his big white Cadillac, leaving Jeremiah behind to do his dirty work. That night, Bo, Luke, and Daisy Duke were out for a drive in the General Lee, Bo's bright red hot rod. As they drove by Widow Johnson's property, Daisy thought she saw lights coming from the attic of the old house. They figured it was a strange time for Widow Johnson to be a-poking around in her attic, but they didn't think much more of it. Not till the next day, when they heard Boss Hogg shooting off his mouth about how he was doing Widow Johnson a big favor buying up her haunted house. Now, Widow Johnson's house may have a chicken or two on the front porch from time to time, and maybe a mouse in the pantry, but anyone with a lick of sense knows it's not full of ghosts. But you know how people are when it comes to this sort of thing. After her property had been on the market for a week, Nobody excepting Boss Hogg had put in a bid. It was beginning to look like his rotten plan was going to work. Now, it's hard to feel sorry for a hog, but I gotta say, I do feel sorry for poor old cousin Jeremiah, holed up in that dusty old attic. Every night, he'd lower a basket out of the window on a long rope, and Boss Hogg would fill it up with food. Jeremiah wanted to know how much longer he'd have to stay cooped up in there. Boss Hogg promised his cousin he'd only have to spend one more day. If Widow Johnson didn't sell the house to Boss Hogg by sundown of the next day, Boss Hogg was withdrawing his bid. The Duke smelled a rat behind all these goings-on. They'd been in Hazzard County long enough to know that when something smelled like a rat, there was usually a hog nearby. After learning that Amos Wiggins and his family were looking for a new place to hang their hats, the Dukes offered to come along for protection if Amos would take a look at Widow Johnson's house. Amos had heard the stories Boss Hogg had been spreading around town and was more than a little scared. But with the Duke boys along for company, he figured he'd be safe enough from the ghosts. Jeremiah saw the Dukes and Amos drive up. After waiting a week in the attic, he was just itching to put that record on the turntable and scare the living bejeebers out of anyone who set foot in the house. The Duke boys and Amos Wiggins were about to get the scare of their lives. Everything was going just fine until Widow Johnson led Bo, Duke, and Amos upstairs. That's when the spookiness started. It didn't take much of the ghost noises before Amos was as frightened as a turkey on the day before Thanksgiving. Bo and Luke tried to convince Amos that something funny was going on, but Mr. Wiggins didn't want to hear it. His face turned as white as a sheet, and his knees started knocking. Before the Duke boys could say another word, Amos sprinted down the stairs as fast as a jackrabbit. Later that same night, the Duke boys returned to Widow Johnson's house. They had decided to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. After a careful search of the upstairs and downstairs, the two of them crept quietly up the attic stairs. The glow from their kerosene lantern revealed the whole story. The attic was full of stereo equipment. And in the corner, sound asleep and snoring away, was Jeremiah. Before he could wake up, the Duke boys slipped a bag over his head, tied him up, and carried him down to the basement. After the Duke secured Jeremiah in the basement, they moved all the sound equipment down there, too. They had worked out a plan to give Boss Hogg a good taste of his own medicine. The next day, when Boss Hogg arrived to take over Widow Johnson's property, the Duke boys were waiting for him. As soon as he was seated in the parlor, the scary sounds began. Boss Hogg shouted for Jeremiah to knock it off. The spooky-sounding ghost replied, "Jeremiah is no longer among us. Come up to the attic and see for yourself." Boss Hogg was sure as sugar that Jeremiah was playing some kind of a game. He shouted till he turned red in the face, and then stomped up the attic stairs, expecting to find Jeremiah and the sound equipment. What he saw made his eyes bug out of his ornery old head. The attic was empty. That's when the Duke boys really started to lay it on heavy. In a low, scary voice, Bo moaned into the microphone. I told you Jeremiah was no longer among us. We got him, and now we're gonna get you too. Old Boss Hogg started in a trembling something powerful. His teeth were chattering and his legs started to buckle under his weight. Boss Hogg let out a pitiful shriek and ran back down the attic steps. On his way out of the house, he shouted to Widow Johnson that she could keep her house. He wasn't about to be taken over a haunted house. Before the good widow could say a word, Boss Hogg leaped into his Cadillac and tore down the road in a cloud of dust. The Duke boys were laughing like crazy as they turned Jeremiah loose and sent him running up the road. He'd learned a lesson he would never forget. It didn't take the Duke boys long to set things right for poor Widow Johnson. Once he learned about the fake haunting, Amos Wiggins was more than happy to pay a fair price for the Johnson house. Widow Johnson took the money and moved in with her cousin May over in Shawnee County. They're happy as two ducks in a rainstorm, running that old antique shop on Route 9. Boss Hogg, he still won't set foot on the property. He swears to this day that Amos Wiggins was a plumb fool for paying more than a nickel for a haunted house. And as for the Duke boys, they kept the whole thing a tight-lipped secret. To this day, they still laugh themselves silly just thinking how they frightened the wits out of Boss Hogg with the Ghost of Hazzard County.